In this video, you and I are going to do three basic things. Number one, we'll take a look at how port security, this feature, is going to protect the network at the switch port level. Two, we'll take a look at some of the prerequisites for it to work. And third, we'll take a look at some of its defaults. That way, when we go to implement it, we won't be surprised by any negative consequences because we can understand beforehand what those defaults are, and then we can change them if we need to. So let's imagine we have this switch right here, and we have port gig 0/0 that we want to set up port security on. Some of the prerequisites for that port is that it cannot be a dynamic layer 2 port. If it is a dynamic layer 2 port, meaning it'll auto-negotiate the port, it will not allow that port to take on the port security command. So an easy fix for that in the port, if this is an access port, we use the command switch port mode access if you want it to be an access port, or switch port mode trunk if you want to be a trunk port. And another technique that's often used is the command switch port space host. And what that does, it forces it into access mode for the port. It also turns on port fast so that you don't have to wait, or your users don't have to wait through the listening and learning states for spanning tree when their computer is connecting to the network. So either way we do it, with switch port mode access directly or switch port host, which inputs the switch port mode access into the configuration, it's important that that port is not a dynamic port. And then associated with that, we'd also want to make sure that this port was in the correct VLAN. So switch port access VLAN 10, or whatever VLAN we want that port to be in. So that's our first prerequisite for getting the feature of port security working. Our next step to enable port security on this interface would go into interface configuration mode and use the command switch port space port security and press enter. And at this point, one of three things typically happens. If the switch and the version of software doesn't support port security, of course it won't take. Or if this port is a dynamic port, meaning it has been hard-coded as an access or a trunk port, we'll get a message saying, whoa, this is a dynamic port, can't use the feature. Or third, we press enter and boom, port security is in place on that port, and away we go. Now, it's important to know what the defaults are for port security, and here they are. Port security says by default that the maximum number of MAC addresses that it will be willing to learn on that port is 1. That's it. And that's the big way of that port protecting the network against multiple people trying to connect at the same time on that port. So if Bob, who's using that port, connects a switch to it and connects 2 or 3 other devices to it, the switch is going to see more than one source MAC address on that port, and that's going to cause a violation. And the default port security violation is pretty severe. It is shut down the port. Boo! Shut it down, shut it down, shut it down. And the switch will actually shut down that port and put it into a state called error disable, which means there's no more traffic flowing through that port. They blew it. They have too many MAC addresses that showed up, and port security says, I'm shutting you down. So the default violation action for port security is to shut down the port. So with these defaults, if Bob tries to connect a switch and connect multiple devices, boom, there's a violation, port is shut down. Or if a hacker connects and he's starting to spoof or lie about lots of source MAC addresses and it exceeds the default maximum for port security, boom, that port is shut down and that switch is protected against the CAM table overflow attack. And in addition, if we want to only allow specific MAC addresses on this port, we can actually train port security about which MAC addresses are allowed. So we take Bob's computer, we get Bob's computer's MAC address configured as being associated with that port, and any other device other than that specific layer 2 MAC address as a source address won't be allowed. Only Bob's computer that has been configured. And that's how port security, when it's applied to layer 2 switch ports, can help protect our network. And in the very next video, you and I will walk through a lab where we'll implement and verify port security on a layer 2 interface. So I'll see you there in just a moment. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.